I want to expand a little on something that I was talking about in a video I shared about a week ago. I was talking about how we're currently going through a period of social turmoil with a lot of hostility, division, and conflict. A lot of what we're seeing and experiencing is a bubbling up of emotion which perhaps for many has been well repressed for a very long time and is now being triggered on a collective scale. A great deal of anxiety, great deal of insecurity in the face of uncertainty, a great deal of frustration and agitation. And I was talking about how our own words and actions at this time can either contribute to more of that, to more chaos and conflict or destruction, or if we're a little more conscious, we can be responding in ways that are motivated by love, compassion, and understanding, thereby contributing to something altogether different, to greater harmony, to greater peace, or at the very least not getting swept up in all the madness. And it's very easy to become consumed and overwhelmed by intense emotions like fear and anger, confusion and hopelessness. And I'm sure that most of us have had our moments, perhaps some more than others. You may even be experiencing some anxiety or agitation at this time in regard to everything that's going on. And in some sense, it's quite natural to feel this way. The reality being that there is a great deal of instability and uncertainty at this time. And so it's very natural to feel anxious about it. What concerns me, however, is what we do with these feelings. And again, there's nothing wrong with these emotions in and of themselves. It's what happens when we allow them to consume us that can often lead to so many problems. And much of what we're witnessing in the world at the moment, all this hostility, hatred, division, violence, and so on, is the result of this emotional overwhelm and the inability to process these emotions in a healthy and constructive way. I've said before in so many words that this is a time for us to either awaken further, that we can expand our awareness, expand our compassion and understanding, or we can become more and more contracted and retreat deeper into sleep, to be controlled by our unconscious mechanisms, or to become more conscious of those mechanisms so that we might transcend them. What we're seeing right now with so many people, and perhaps in ourselves as well, is a kind of impulsive reactivity, a very automatic and mechanical way of behaving without much awareness of ourselves and our internal psychological mechanisms. We become consumed by intense emotion, which clouds our ability to see clearly and to act wisely. Instead, we act impulsively, irrationally, sometimes aggressively, and in many cases we can wind up making matters much worse. Oftentimes, after a fit of rage, for example, people will say, "I don't know what came over me," or "I wasn't myself," or something of that sort. Because what often happens is that you become possessed by the emotion. It takes control of you. It overrides your rational faculties. It clouds your perception. When we're consumed in this way, there's no consideration of consequence. There's no clarity of the situation. Our whole faculty to think critically, logically, rationally, all of that gets drowned out or obscured. We can become hysterical, panicked, paranoid, lashing out at one another, in some cases becoming quite violent. We tend to be so absorbed in our own fear and anger to the degree that we become totally disconnected from others, in the sense that we can no longer relate, no longer empathize. And so instead we tend to demonize others. A lot of the conflict I see is between people who have taken to these opposing factions, where it's us against them. And the other is seen as irrational and hostile, and therefore to be feared and to be fought. And it doesn't really matter which side you're on, because the reality is that everyone is afraid on both sides of the divide. And everyone, consumed and compelled by that fear, is engaging with hostility towards those who they perceive as a threat. And in that way, everyone becomes a threat to one another, which just perpetuates the fear and aggression. And the whole thing builds and builds, and where does it stop? What's important right now is to watch for this sort of thing in oneself. to be aware of one's own anxiety and agitation. And as I said, probably most of us have been experiencing these emotions to some degree or another during this time. And to be watchful that we don't become so possessed by it that we lose all clarity and begin engaging in ways that contribute to more conflict and division, to more hostility and hatred, and so on. All of that is reactivity, which again means that we aren't thinking clearly, we aren't seeing things clearly. We're just behaving impulsively, automatically, irrationally. And it doesn't really matter how intelligent a person is. That intelligence gets overridden by these intense emotions. Often we think that certain people are just stupid, but actually many of them are quite intelligent. It's just that their ability to use their intelligence wisely becomes unavailable to them in the heat of the moment. And this can happen even to the best of us. Even if we're generally very rational, calm, caring, compassionate, and so on, once we become consumed by fear, all of that can be obscured. What is important is that we're able to respond rather than react. And response is a very different thing from reaction. To respond requires a certain degree of clarity. It requires a moment of pause, a moment of reflection. So you notice this fear arising in you, or anger, or whatever it happens to be. But instead of impulsively acting upon it, you just observe that impulse to react, to observe it without indulging it. And instead you take a moment to breathe deeply into that space, to be present with it, to relax with it, and to allow your mind to settle a little. And it may not become completely calm, but perhaps calm enough to have a little more clarity, calm enough so that you regain access to your rational faculties, calm enough that you can reflect upon the situation and find the most appropriate response, that you can engage in a way that might bring about a solution. And you may find that there is no need at all to respond. Sometimes the situation doesn't need your response. Sometimes it's just a waste of energy, and it may be better to just leave it alone. Of course, it all depends on the situation, but if you can come into a space of clarity, you'll know exactly what is needed in that moment. When we're engaging with others who appear to be irrational in their beliefs and their behaviors, who speak with hostility or insensitivity, with a little clarity you might realize that the other person is simply consumed by their own anxiety and agitation. And if we can see this, if we can see that the other is consumed by fear, we have to also consider how our own words and behavior might exacerbate it. Or can we perhaps engage in a way that helps to ease their fear? If we want to communicate successfully with someone in that agitated state of mind, the first thing is to put their mind at ease. Although I don't know that you can easily do that. Perhaps in most cases you won't be able to. So it's often best not to engage at all. At the very least, we can be empathetic, understanding. And with that understanding, to have some compassion. And this is something people often misunderstand. When we talk about having compassion for those who are hostile to us, a lot of people mistake this to mean that we allow the other person to mistreat or abuse us. But we can have compassion for someone and also set healthy boundaries. In fact, compassion for others really begins with compassion for oneself. And if you care about yourself, if you respect yourself, You'll care enough not to allow others to abuse you. But when I say that we can have compassion for them, this simply means that rather than harboring hatred or hostility in our heart, we can recognize that the other person is suffering, and we can empathize with that suffering. How compassion is expressed at any given moment, or whether we express it at all, that simply depends on the situation. Sometimes compassion means that we don't say or do anything at all. We just wish them well in our heart and quietly walk away. Now, if I can perhaps offer a little something from my own experience recently. A lot of the hostility that we're seeing begins on social media, with people being triggered by the things that they see and read, and getting into all kinds of arguments and such. So, a little while back, I had posted something which someone took disagreement with, and it was clear by their comment, with all of its expletives and name-calling, that this had triggered some intense emotion in that person. And upon reading their comment, I immediately felt this wave of intense emotion flow all throughout my body. I felt my muscles tense up, my breathing becoming tight. And had I replied to them in that moment, who knows what I may have said. Now, if there's one good thing about social media, it's that you're not having a face-to-face conversation, which means that there's no pressure to respond immediately. You can take all the time you need, or not respond at all. And in retrospect, I realize I probably should not have responded. Well, what I did was I decided to just step away for a time. I went and I sat outside. I sat with this feeling. I took a series of deep breaths. I redirected my attention to this moment, taking in the sounds around me. And after my mind had settled down a little, I went back. And so, very politely, I asked this person to explain precisely what it was they disagreed with. I let them know that I was open to hearing their perspective, and that perhaps my own perspective might be flawed in some way. Now, unfortunately, they didn't offer any sort of counter-argument. They simply continued in the same manner, simply saying that my perspective is wrong, without providing any explanation as to why, and with the same kind of childish name-calling. So it was clear to me after all of this that we weren't going to be able to have a calm, rational discussion. And being that this was someone I had been friends with for many years, I said, look, we don't have to agree on this. And just so you know, I have no animosity towards you. You're my friend, and I still have a great deal of love and respect for you. And I thought that this was a good way to close the conversation. But they had a different way of closing it, however. There was no reply from them after that. And soon after, I came to find that they had actually removed me from their contacts, which I suppose was their way of quietly ending our friendship. It's unfortunate that this sort of thing is happening so frequently. So many friendships are being torn apart by disagreements, by misunderstandings, miscommunication, driven by intense emotional reactivity that leaves no room for civil discussion. Looking back, I could see that this person was consumed with anxiety and agitation, which clouded their ability to see and think clearly, calmly, and rationally. And it should have been obvious to me from their very first comment had I been more perceptive of this, it would have been wise of me to simply ignore it and move on. So what we're talking about is what is the most conductive or constructive way to respond to any given situation, in particular to what is going on in the world at the moment, in response to so much anxiety and agitation, in response to all of this turmoil. And again, we all get triggered now and then. We all become agitated, angry, anxious, or what have you. And it's good to acknowledge this in oneself, to be aware of one's own reactivity. And not that we should deny it or try to suppress it, but at the same time, being careful not to be so swept up in it that we lose all clarity and wind up behaving in ways that make the situation worse. That is, to take a moment to pause and to breathe and to assess the situation rather than reacting impulsively. And as I said, some situations don't need a response, but even in regard to those which do, we need to have some sense of what it is we would like to achieve. What is it that we would like to see come about as a result of our response? And what kind of action is most likely to result in that outcome? If we simply react impulsively, we may not get the results we want, and in many cases we may just make matters worse. We may just create more of what we don't want. But if we can take time to cool down, to let the mind calm a little, to let the mud settle so that we can see a little more clearly, we can respond more calmly, more effectively, more constructively. Sometimes, or perhaps oftentimes, when we're all worked up about something, we don't have all the details. We have yet to see the bigger picture. Or we may be reacting to someone's speculations, or to some rumor, or even to a blatant lie. And if we react too hastily, we may be making a foolish mistake. We may even create a problem where there really was no problem to begin with. So by taking a little time to pause and step back, we can also become more inquisitive. We can take a little time to investigate the situation or the information to see if our initial perception is correct. This is especially useful these days with so much misinformation being spread around on the internet or on cable news, as well as many other places. It seems to come from every conceivable direction these days. And misinformation doesn't always mean outright lies. It often simply means selective facts presented in such a way as to paint a very particular narrative. And there have been many times when I saw a story going around that was generating a lot of anxiety or anger, and I would find myself having the same initial reaction as most everyone else. But then pausing and stepping back, I would inquire as to whether I was being presented with all the facts, or if this was a distortion of reality, or perhaps nothing more than a rumor in some cases. And many times I would inquire in this way only to discover that there were a number of important details which had been omitted from the story, probably intentionally, and which, once becoming aware of them, presented a very different picture. In some cases, I found that my initial fear or anger was greatly exaggerated or completely unwarranted once the entirety of the situation was known. But even if the situation was such that it was truly justified to feel this way, there was still the question of whether it would be useful in my response. Now, it may be that sometimes fear or anger are useful in our response, but more often than not, they just tend to make matters worse. So it's always important to take a moment to breathe and to assess the situation. Asking ourselves, first of all, what is within my power to resolve or influence or affect? Because sometimes the situation is beyond our control, and there is nothing that we can do about it. And all our outrage or anxiety is completely useless. All it does is cause us to suffer needlessly. But supposing that it is something which we can have some influence over, we can then ask ourselves, what is it that I would like to see different about this situation? What kind of change or outcome do I want? And what kind of action is the best course of action to arrive at that outcome? So, can we be more mindful of our reactivity? Can we be mindful of our impulses? Can we be mindful of the arising of intense emotion? And see if you can just sit with it, not indulging it, not repressing it, but just being present with it, breathing into it, just allowing it space to breathe and to settle. See what happens when you don't immediately react. See what happens if you step back a little, allowing some space between yourself and the thoughts and emotions arising in that space. Take a moment to gently guide your attention back to the present, to allow it to rest here for a time. You can think of the succession of thoughts and emotions as a current, like the current of a river. And it's very easy to get swept away in that current, especially when the current is strong, such as in the case of intense emotional reactions. And to be mindful is to step out of the river, to step out onto the bank, and to rest there and to simply watch the river flowing past. We're not fighting the current. We're not trying to block it or stop it or change its course. We're not interfering with it in any way at all. We're just stepping out of it, stepping back from it, resting on the bank and watching it pass by. If we can take a moment to pause and to be present, that's usually when the solutions arise, not when we're clouded by intense emotion, not when we're overthinking or overreacting, not when we're swept away. Oftentimes we simply need to take a moment to be still and to allow a space of quiet receptivity for clarity and guidance to come. And this is a good practice to engage in. And you'll have plenty of opportunities in life to practice this, I promise you. There will be many times in life when situations arise that bring about some reaction in you. And you can simply take notice of it. Catch yourself getting all worked up. And then take a moment to pause and to be present with it. And you may notice each time that your reactivity decreases in both intensity and duration. You may notice that you have more clarity in regard to the situations that arise. You may notice that you're more able to remain calm in the face of adversity. You may notice that you make wiser decisions. You may notice a reduction in tension and conflict in your life, as well as the ability to resolve conflict much more easily. You may notice a greater peace of mind, even in the midst of chaos. But it all begins with self-awareness, with self-observation, with mindfulness, with the willingness to pause for a moment and to let the mud settle. If you find value in this content, be sure to like, share, and subscribe.